The following program is one of a number of programs NBC TV will present during the bicentennial year to celebrate our country's 200th anniversary.
Frederick Douglass began his 4th of July speech at Rochester, New York on July 5th, 1852 in this manner.
The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. Well, this certainly sounds large and out of the common way for me. It is true that I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence. But neither their familiar faces nor the perfect gauge I think I have of Corinthian Hall seems to free me from embarrassment. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is to me a matter of astonishment as well as of gratitude.
In 76 the sky was red, thunder rumbling overhead, that King George couldn't sleep in his bed, and on that stormy morn, old Uncle Sam was born.
Hello, I'm Roscoe Brown of New York University, and with me is Dr. Ralph Carter of Livingston College of Rutgers University. And those words from Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech, as read by the distinguished actor Moses Gunn, reflect, in a sense, how blacks in the 1850s were feeling about slavery.
Yes, Douglass has sort of epitomized the American slave. His life tells us over and over again. As a matter of fact, his 3 biographies go deep into the experiences of what it was like to be a slave. And this transcends the plantation records and things that the master class have talked about so often.
I think in 1975, as we talk about slavery and blacks' attempts to throw off the yoke of slavery, we tend to forget the actual brutality of American slavery, of the institution of slavery. See, racism still exists, and we see that every day, but many of us, both black and white, have forgotten the brutality of slavery as was practiced in the 18th and 19th century.
Slavery was so devastating on its effects on American society that we try to push it aside, push it into the background, but it has influenced all of our institutions. It influences the way that we operate even today.
Well, of course, it's like a bad dream for America, but one of the things that history has sort of obscured from most of us, and that is the fact that blacks really didn't take this easily, that blacks were constantly organizing revolts, constantly trying to escape, and constantly trying to undermine the system in a variety of ways.
Yes, slavery was a many varied, there were many varied reactions to slavery. And it was a vast institution that took in hundreds of thousands, millions of lives, both black and white. And so consequently, we cannot discuss slavery in narrow confines. We're talking about an entire society.
Well, of course, if you think about that, we have to think about those blacks who really led the fight for abolition. And of course, right at the head of the pack is Frederick Douglass, largely because of his fantastic oratorical skills as reflected in this 4th of July address, which people remember even today. But there were also people like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and some lesser known blacks who were equally courageous in their fight for freedom.
Yes, Frederick Douglass himself gave credit to Samuel Ringo Ward, saying he was the most eloquent speaker of the time. And just prior to Douglas, Charles Lennox Ramon, who was not only a great speaker and orator, but had traveled to Europe to speak on slavery's cause. But when Douglas came up, here was a man who was a slave. Ramon had been born in New England, and so they pushed Ramon to the side. Ramon's sister, Laura Ramon, was another black woman abolitionist who was very eloquent and went along with the women suffragettes talking about not only slavery but women's rights.
But of course, the thing that we have to realize is that at that time, with so many millions of black people held in bondage, it did require the arising of moral indignation on the part of the white, and then a particular type of socio-economic friction between the North and the South to bring about the actual conflict that led to the end of slavery. But before we go into that, suppose you tell us about just the way in which slaves lived and the way in which the slave institution affected black people in the 1800s.
American slavery was devastating in its effects on both master and slave. The reality is that it brutalized both. While the varying course of development in the colonies meant that the institution of slavery played different roles, everywhere the institution itself took on the same basic aspect. That is, for the black slave, it was perpetual and inheritable. It was confined to blacks, unlike other forms of servitude in America. It typically resulted in total deprivation of civil, political, and social rights. And unlike previous kinds of slavery in human history, its victims were denied the opportunity to improve themselves and were thus stigmatized by virtually indelible badges of inferiority which pursued them even into emancipation. An examination of the slave codes of several states will enhance and enlighten our understanding of just how brutal American slavery really was. A slave was given minimal protection by the law. His inferior civil status derived from the fact that he and his fellows were recognized as property rather than as persons, and were therefore beyond the pale of civil rights. The stereotype of the darkies are gay contrasts starkly with the facts. According to slave law, a slave's children could be sold. His marriage was not recognized. His wife and daughters could be violated by the master, his sons, and or other white men without being prosecuted. There was something comic about calling the woman with whom the master permitted the man to live a wife, since she could be sold. Sexual excursions on his part towards white females resulted in castration and death. The darkies were gay indeed. A slave was also subject without redress in law to frightful barbarities. The slave could not by law be taught to read or write. He was totally ignorant of and almost completely cut off from his ancestral past. It was continually impressed upon him that his African blood tainted him. A slave could not practice any religion without the permission of his master, and could never meet with his fellows for religious or any other purpose except in the presence of whites. Finally, if a master wished to free him, every legal obstacle was used to thwart such action. Consequently, a slave was offered no hope for the future.
Well, as you hear that litany of oppression and transgressions against the soul of men, you wonder why a nation, America, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, would carry out, would allow this to happen. Now, it's true, in our earlier programs, we've talked about the resistance of the Founding Fathers to providing first-class citizens to blacks, but still, some 75 years after the Declaration of Independence, we still have slavery flourishing and a raging battle going on in the country as to whether this institution, which dehumanized man so much, was going to continue.
It's the tremendous profits that were derived from slavery. I think that the Founding Fathers themselves desired to get rid of slavery. As we talked about earlier in the different programs, the desire on their part and not only the ambivalence but the agony of a person like Jefferson, who saw that slavery itself was contaminating and undermining all of the political and social institutions of the country. But there was such tremendous profit in slavery. And the slave himself built the country. It was because of the slave institution that the country was able to expand across the continent so rapidly. It would have taken probably another 200 years for the
in other words,
country to develop like this.
you're suggesting, as some contemporary blacks say, that blacks really built America, and without the back labor of blacks, that America could not have grown as rapidly as it did into the #1 nation in the world.
Oh, yeah, definitely. At the end of the Civil War, the property in slaves alone in the South equaled in gross assets over $3 billion.
You mean the value of the man?
The value of the man.
And which meant the value of his labor.
Right, and that was a tremendous amount of the profits and the property value of the South was really enslaved.
What about the allegation that American slavery was the most brutal in the history of man, and that no other institution of slavery had so taken away rights of men as had American slavery? What about that allegation?
We have a number of scholars who have attacked this. This was really the Tannenbaum thesis, and this has been really destroyed.
Now, what is the Tannenbaum thesis?
Well, Tannenbaum said that slavery in the Americas was the most brutal slave system in the history of mankind, and that the British system, especially in America itself, the United States, brutalized slaves far more than anyone else. Now, we've had a number of people, David Bryan Davis, in two books, The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture, which Pulitzer Prize winner, and his recent book, Problem of Slavery in Revolutionary Age, which has compared slavery throughout history, especially in Western culture, and has shown that slavery was brutal in the Roman world, for example, and throughout the Americas. Curtin has shown that far more slaves were brought, in his book Atlantic Slave Trade Census, far more slaves were brought into other areas of the New World, and only 6% of slaves from Africa came into the United States. So that we find that the idea of physical brutality was not really in existence in the United States, and you know, it was not the only place that you had.
Of course, there's something beyond physical brutality. I think that the emotional and the mental brutality that was perpetrated against blacks, separating families, teaching them systematically that their culture was inferior, could put a stamp of inferiority on people for generations.
That's correct. And also their efforts to free themselves. What was some of the efforts of blacks to free themselves, Roscoe?
Now, it would be unusual for men held in bondage, as black slaves were, not to attempt to escape or throw off the yoke of oppression by force. It is estimated that there were over 200 slave rebellions in the United States, the most important of which were Gabriel Prosser's in 1800, Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in 1822, and Nat Turner's insurrection in 1831. Turner's insurrection, which has been memorialized in his own Confessions of Nat Turner, was in a sense the most successful in that the revolt actually became a reality. 60 whites and over 100 blacks were killed in the revolt, which occurred in Southampton County, Virginia. Unlike the Prosser and Vesey revolts, which also occurred in Virginia, Turner's revolt came to fruition because he was able to prevent black informers from tipping off the masters about the impending revolts. While Prosser, Vesey, and Turner were all hanged for their attempts, the mere fact that hundreds and even thousands of blacks would contemplate taking up arms in behalf of their freedom terrorized whites to the extent that most states strengthened their black codes aimed at restricting the movements of blacks. It is important to note that there were some white supporters of white insurrections. In at least one instance, whites were arrested and sentenced because of their participation in a revolt. Although some white historians have suggested that black slaves were too docile, happy, and satisfied to attack the system that was oppressing them, the facts belie such assertions. By 1860, the climate concerning slavery had changed considerably. Many powerful figures had begun to doubt the economic value of slavery, but the issues of freedom and equality were still confounded by persistent racism in both the North and the South. Even among those who opposed slavery on moral grounds, there was considerable ambivalence over the right of blacks to equal treatment. A man named Douglas was one of the most outspoken people in behalf of black freedom. Frederick Douglass's speech on the meaning of 4th of July for the Negro best epitomizes blacks' view of the situation.
What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States. At this very hour, go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of the everyday practices of this nation, and you will say to me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism a sham, your humanity a base pretense, and your Christianity a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. It is the antagonistic force in your government, the only thing that seriously disturbs and endangers your union. It fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride. It breeds insolence. It promotes vice. It shelters crimes. It is a curse to the earth that supports it. And yet you cling to it as it were the sheet anchor of your hopes.
And so you see, even before the Civil War, blacks had evinced strong desires for freedom and equality. Besides slave revolts, blacks in urban areas frequently defied federal authority, especially in thwarting the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and spoke increasingly of violence and disunion to achieve freedom. Blacks participated in many patterns of change as part of the general anti-slavery movement, but they also organized and acted on their own. The Negro Convention movement was even and was perhaps the principal agency for black activists. From the first convention movement in 1830 right up to the Civil War, we had tremendous stirrings. By 1861, the steady drive for emancipation had all but isolated the southern slave states. And they were, by the very persistence of their peculiar institution, becoming more and more unique. Elsewhere in the New World, only in Cuba and Brazil had slavery survived beyond the 1850s. And neither of these countries attempted to defend slavery as a positive good. The emancipation of the Russian serfs in 1861 cleared the last vestige of forced labor in Europe. The Civil War had hardly begun before the uncompromising senior senator from Massachusetts, Charles Sumner, began to urge the president to the outright emancipation of the slaves. Among other abolitionists, none more than the black leader Frederick Douglass pressed on President Lincoln the necessity of converting the war into a crusade against slavery. Lincoln pondered. Finally, on September 22nd, 1862, after a Union victory at Antietam 5 days earlier, he issued what is commonly referred to as the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The significant feature of the proclamation was a provision that called for the emancipation of the slaves on January 1, 1863, in those states or portions of states that were in rebellion against the United States. The clear implication was that if states or portions of states were not in rebellion on January 1, 1863, the proclamation would not apply to them.
And of course, that makes sort of a hollow mockery of the statement that you learn in elementary school that Lincoln freed the slaves. Basically, I think you might say the slaves freed themselves by their insistent resistance to slavery, and more than that, quite possibly the economic conditions, the economic friction between the North and the South led to the fact that it became expedient to make it possible for slaves to be free. But I believe the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really free anybody.
It freed about 15,000 slaves out of about 4.5 million. The emancipation, the reason Lincoln pondered was because several people in his cabinet cautioned him about issuing the Emancipation Proclamation too quickly, because the North was suffering a series of setbacks in the war. And they didn't want it to look as though that Lincoln had turned to Ethiopia, meaning the blacks, to get out of this dilemma, that the North had gotten out of the dilemma by going to the slaves themselves, asking for help.
Well, how would freeing the slaves give help to the Union? Because actually what happened, even in the limited number who were freed, that the South nor the North knew what to do with them. They'd run to the Union side, and the Union side said, get over to the Confederate side, and the Confederate side said, we don't want you, or we'll put you to work. You might be free, but you're working for us now. A
number of things occurred. First, the proclamation itself, even though it didn't free many, see, the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, was not a moral document, it was a military document. That's number one. Number two is the fact that how the proclamation was viewed in Europe. Many of the workers, especially in England and France, and England was contemplated even going on the side offering aid to the southern states. The workers were totally against Britain supporting the Southern cause. And the issuance of the Emancipation swung them strongly to the side of the North, and England backed off of what their normal intentions would have been.
In other words, there was some moral suasion involved in the Civil War and in the Emancipation Proclamation, but in a sense it was a very practical document for the Union, for Lincoln to issue in order to mobilize political support behind the Northern cause.
Yes, it's not so much how many slaves were legally freed, but it was how the Emancipation Proclamation was viewed by the slaves. You see, before that, many slaves who were came into the line were looked upon as contraband. Earlier, they had even been sent back to their masters. But once this proclamation was issued, hundreds of thousands of slaves ran to the Union line. And the slave had been the base of support for the southern military
for the military economy.
Right.
But even when they ran to the Union line, as we said earlier, sometimes they were sent back mistakenly. But the Union itself set up camps. You wouldn't call them concentration camps, but they were reception camps where they put the escaped slaves because of the proclamation, and they didn't really know what to do, which set up another set of problems which occurred in the Reconstruction. What do you do with this newly freed group of people for whom the society is not prepared and whose color is different, and then allows that pervasive theme of racism to still affect black people as it does today? But let's go back a bit. The role of Douglas. Douglas, as we said, was the premier spokesman for blacks in the abolitionist cause. Douglas went to Lincoln to get black troops to be able to fight on behalf of their own freedom, and some 250,000 or 300,000 blacks actually fought on the Union side for their own freedom. And I think that's something that everyone needs to know.
Very significant. They fought, there was 188,000 black soldiers that fought in the Civil War, and over 30,000 black sailors who fought in integrated units. A number of them received Congressional Medals of Honor. Joachim Pease, for example, was the great gunner on the Kearsarge that helped destroy the Alabama, which was a deadly Southern ship. They fought at major battles in the West, especially in the Mississippi Valley area. They fought at Fort Wagner, Fort Pocatello, Fort Pillow. They were instrumental in the struggle, the final struggle to take Richmond.
And of course, Douglas had to go back again to Lincoln to be certain that the black troops were treated with a certain amount of fairness, because when they were taken by the Confederates, frequently they were treated not as prisoners of war, but as escaped slaves. Similarly, the Union did not recognize blacks as being equal, and they paid them different levels of money. So that Douglas was constantly in communication with Lincoln about trying to see that blacks, even when they're trying to fight for their freedom, were treated with some degree of equality.
Yes. For example, the slaughter of black troops at Fort Pillow and Fort Pocatello, in which Nathan Bedford Forrest, who later became even more famous for establishing the Ku Klux Klan, blacks, instead of being treated as prisoners of war, were slaughtered. Dogs were set upon them on one occasion. This was not the treatment in times of war, the types of rules that one would operate under. They were treated almost like animals.
And of course, the point that Douglas was trying to make with Lincoln is that he should let it be known that as President and Commander-in-Chief of the Union forces, he wasn't going to tolerate this, because the same thing could happen to Confederate troops. But basically, again, that theme of racism comes through, that most of the black units, practically all of them, were commanded at the very top by white leaders. Sometimes black troops would shoot these white leaders, but in some other instances, the black troops were so loyal to them that they would fight even harder for them, because they recognized the ambivalent position that the Union commanders were in.
The beauty of the black soldier in Civil War is significantly illustrated by the 54th Massachusetts. When you showed that they were getting unequal pay, they refused to receive the pay. And it was near the end of the war, 1864, late 1864, that Congress passed provisions so that black soldiers would receive the same pay as white soldiers.
And I think it's important that black people, and white as well, recognize that blacks did fight physically for their own freedom. It's also important to recognize that we did need a man like Douglas to lead us through this forest. And the closing words of Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech, as read by Moses Gunn, put the issue to the United States of America thusly.
Oh, to be warned. A horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you the hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 millions crush and destroy it forever.
In 76 the sky was red, thunder rumbling overhead. Bad King George couldn't sleep in his bed, and on that stormy morn, old Uncle Sam was born.